My name is Quinn Reed, and I am the coordinator of the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics, and thank you for attending tonight's presentation. The Dole Student Advisory Board is composed of KU students committed to the work of the Dole Institute. Before we begin tonight, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. After the interview, we will have some time for audience questions and answers. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and a student helper with a microphone will come to you. Please ask just one brief question. And now I'd like to introduce you to the Associate Director of the Dole Institute of Politics, Barbara Ballard.
Thank you, Quinn. Good evening and welcome to the Robert J. Dole Institute of Politics at the University of Kansas. We are pleased to have you join us for the Presidential Lecture Series, The First Lady's Intimate Sacrifice Honored Post with Richard Norton Smith. The 2014 Presidential Lecture Series is sponsored in part by the William T. Kemper II Charitable Trust and Commerce Trust Company and Bob Lloyd co-trustees. This evening's interview will be conducted by Bill Lacey, Director of the Dole Institute. Richard Norton Smith was the first permanent director of the Dole Institute and is a noted presidential historian. He is also a regular guest here at the Dole Institute. Would you please give a warm Jayhawk welcome to Richard Norton Smith?
Richard, welcome back to the Dole Institute. Let's start with President Buchanan. He was a lifelong bachelor.
It's a pretty depressing place to start.
Okay.
Except it's gotten better since
Yes,
then.
okay. Lifelong bachelor. How did he take care of the role of First Lady during his administration?
Well, you know, the interesting thing is the Buchanan administration, which has very few successes to its name, actually was very well served by the woman who performed the role of hostess. It was his niece, a woman named Harriet Lane, who by all accounts inherited her uncle's diplomatic skills, but in addition to that, a degree of charisma and warmth that were notably lacking in President Buchanan. Remember, anyone in the White House at that point, President or First Lady, would face a particular challenge because although the Civil War would not begin until April of 1861, the fact of the matter is it was already raging out here on the prairies of Kansas and in the drawing rooms of Washington. And one of the remarkable things about Harriet Lane, who became, by the way, probably our first celebrity First Lady. Her image was published widely. The song Listen to the Mockingbird was dedicated to Harriet Lane. Her greatest social triumph was when she welcomed the Prince of Wales, the first to hold that title, to visit the United States. But beyond that, she managed to forestall overt civil warfare from breaking out under the roof of the White House and to have Northern and Southern representatives meet in something approximating civil society, and that's no small accomplishment. When she died, she left money in her will to erect a statue to President Buchanan because nobody else would. And you can see it today, unsuitably grand, in Meridian Hill Park in Washington.
Okay. Mrs. Lincoln is one of the most interesting figures that we had as First Lady, so we're going to spend a little bit of time on her tonight. Can you start with just describing her life before she became First Lady?
Well, just as I'm fond of saying the last word will never be written on Abraham Lincoln, my hunch is it pertains to his wife as well. She is, as much as he is, and in some ways more, the subject of continuing debate and divided scholarship. They had some things in common. They had remarkably dissimilar upbringings. Of course, Lincoln born in abject poverty in rural Kentucky into a dirt floor log cabin. Her father was a very prosperous lawyer, merchant, member of the Kentucky legislature. Her girlhood home is you can visit it in Lexington even now. A very handsome brick home. Her first crisis in life occurred when she was 6 years old, and her mother died. Of course, Lincoln lost his mother when he was 9. That was something they had in common. On the other hand, whereas Lincoln was extraordinarily fortunate in his stepmother, Sarah Lincoln, Mary fell victim to the classic wicked stepmother syndrome. Now, that worked two ways. She was sent off to various schools where she, in fact, got a much longer and more substantive education than most young women of her class would. Mademoiselle Montel, she learned French and drawing, and somewhere she learned the art of conversation. She also learned to love politics, and that set her apart from a very early age. Apparently, it came from her father, who was himself in politics. She's also, however, said to have had a maternal grandmother who was an abolitionist. And from an early age, she contained the divisions that Kentucky epitomized, and that would, of course, reach their climax when she was living in the White House. Of course, she was precluded from acting upon that interest in politics because of her sex. And she's a classic case of someone who channeled her interests into the man that she would marry. In fact, I think it was politics that really brought them together. It was politics that forged this very unusual partnership. Lincoln idolized Henry Clay. Well, Henry Clay lived just down the road from the Todds in Lexington. Indeed, he was a friend of Mary's father and was Mary's young idol as well. I often thought Henry Clay was a kind of unwitting matchmaker. It was the political allegiance there that gave them something, because otherwise they were about as disparate a couple as can be imagined. She, however, seems never to have doubted. He doubted, she didn't, that he had a political future, and indeed that it was not beyond the realm of possibility that he would inhabit the White House one day. Now, it must be said that there are, and always have been, and I suspect always will be, a civil war among Lincoln scholars. There are, to this day, Abe people and Mary people. And sometimes they are civil to one another, and sometimes you cannot get them to appear on the same stage. There are Abe people who, it's not too, I think, far-fetched to say, hate Mary. And I think our popular culture has imbibed some of that, I think partly because we sympathize with the hell that Lincoln went through in the Civil War. Therefore, anything that even inadvertently made things emotionally worse for Lincoln is to be deplored. What that overlooks is the extraordinary price that Mary paid in the course of her life. Not only, as I say, losing her mother at a most impressionable age. Remember, Lincoln jilted her. They were to be married on the 1st of January, 1841, and for reasons that historians are still debating, he, in effect, walked away from that ceremony, and it was almost 2 years before they were brought back together and were married in November of 1842. This is a woman accustomed to luxury, and she lives in the Globe Tavern in Springfield, Illinois, with her husband and their children. And then when he is elected to his one term in Congress, She accompanies him, which is unusual because wives, particularly freshman congressmen, did not often do that. It turned out to be an unsuccessful experiment. Life in a Washington boarding house was really impossible. So she and their son, Bobby, went back to Lexington, back to the luxury that she had known. But then came the long crossing the desert years when Lincoln was not only out of office, but assumed to be a political corpse. At one point, he was offered the governorship of Oregon as a kind of political substitute for office holding, and by his fellow Whigs. And it was Mary who said no. If you go to Oregon, you are putting an end to your, however meager, national political prospects. When there was lobbying to be done for jobs from Whig administrations, it was Mary who drafted the letters. This is unheard of in 19th century marriages, with some exceptions. We talked about Sarah Polk. Certainly Abigail Adams would have regarded herself as a full political partner. But in any event, Mrs. Lincoln sustained, and spouses, it's one thing for a candidate to lose an election. It hurts, but it's part of the job. Spouses and families, I think there's a special kind of hurt. They take it as a personal rejection of the man they love. And he lost more elections than he won, and 2 elections for the Senate. But in any event, through an unlikely series of events that dovetailed with the pending crack-up of the Union, Lincoln found himself the Republican nominee for president in 1860. And again, it was Mary who acted as his hostess. And there are lots of contemporary accounts from folks who testify to what an impressive figure she cut, how comfortable she seemed to be. Back in Washington, then as now, a kind of a nest of snobs. Anyone outside Washington is regarded as, out there in the real America, And Mrs. Lincoln was thought to be this crude Westerner. She was called the Republican Queen, and it was a very mixed compliment. Harriet Lane, among others, thought that the world was going to hell in a handbasket, not just because of Lincoln's election, but because, Mary Todd Lincoln was going to be taking her place. So Mrs. Lincoln came to Washington, on the one hand, triumphant, vindicated in her lifelong faith and love, and at the same time, having something to prove.
What kind of first lady was she, Richard?
Well, again, the old argument, the old line, history is argument without end. And anything you say about Mary Lincoln, there are people who will argue exactly the opposite. First of all, let's acknowledge that she held the job, and as he held his job, in an absolutely unprecedented time of national turmoil. We think we live in a politically polarized culture, or we think back to the 60s and the horror of assassinations and increasingly unpopular war, and other periods in American history when obviously there's been anything but consensus. But the Lincolns spent their entire presidency, except the last 5 days, under the shadow of national disintegration. And remember, adding to the burdens, I said she had a stepmother. She has a slew of half-brothers and sisters. One of her brothers fought for the Confederacy. 3 of her half-brothers fought for the Confederacy. And her half-sister, Emily Helm's husband, became actually a quite noted Confederate general who died in the course of the war. Mrs. Lincoln, from day one, was mostly whispered about in the North as a Confederate sympathizer. And in the South, quite openly, traduced as a traitor to her region and her way of life. She carried all of that with her to Washington. The irony is, she thought that by spending $26,000 to refurbish the White House, it wasn't about glorifying her years in the White House. It was about testament to the permanence of Republican small r institutions. It was in her sphere what she could do to further the work of her husband. He, of course, was outraged, as many historians have been, and many journalists were at the time. On the other hand, people who saw the White House, and who, it's a wonderful story. Lincoln was at the dinner table, and of course he was famed for his informal approach to most things, including living in the White House. And he would feed Tabby the cat with a gold spoon. And Mrs. Lincoln, who took a much more hierarchical view of life, was always chastising him for feeding Tabby with a gold spoon. And Lincoln said, if it was good enough for Buchanan, it's good enough for Tabby. Then, of course, you have this, if someone wrote this as a novel, people would say, oh, no, that couldn't be. You couldn't make this up. In February 1862, Mrs. Lincoln finally is in a position to show her critics, A, she's not a crude Westerner. She has taste, and the White House looks better than it has, probably in its history. And so she throws a big party. And she is criticized for throwing a big party at a time when, obviously, there are men on the battlefield in want of blankets. What makes the party both memorable and tragic is, at one and the same time, while her social triumph is unfolding on the ground floors of the White House, and indeed there were people there were guests who stayed until sunrise. By all accounts, it was a huge and hugely successful event, but it was forever clouded for the Lincolns by the simple fact that upstairs, their son, Willie, was dying of typhoid. Now, they'd already lost a son, Eddie, a number of years earlier, living in Springfield. And Willie, no one wants to say out loud that you have a favorite child, but it was pretty clear. Willie, by all accounts, was a lovable and in many ways very impressive, showed great promise intellectually, had a very distinct personality, and his loss was one that I don't think she ever got over. But I've always thought that night, during that evening, as quietly as they could, as unobtrusively as they could, the Lincolns would slip away from their guests in the East Room and go up to see how Willie was faring. He died 2 weeks later. Mrs. Lincoln never went into the green room again. That was the room where his body was embalmed. I don't think, as I say, I think if you're looking for kind of a turning point, she had been, the word I would use was mercurial all her life. High-strung was a word applied to her as a child. Terrified of thunderstorms and a whole host of other things. And yet capable of being the life of the party and of demonstrating a very sophisticated grasp of politics and issues and the like, and people. She was forever trying to get Lincoln to fire his cabinet. He once said, "Mother, if I listened to you, I wouldn't have a cabinet." Because, see, it's the exact opposite. Remember the team of rivals. Lincoln surrounded himself with the men who had been his political adversaries. And precisely because she didn't trust them or their loyalty, she, operating from that very protective instinct, and we can think of other first ladies, thank God, who have it, she wanted him to get rid of them. He took the long view, and probably the politically shrewder view. But I do think after February of '62, you can mark a year later. People tend to overlook this. During the Battle of Gettysburg, first 3 days of July, 1863, she suffers a terrible carriage accident. There was some question at the time and since whether in fact it was an assassination attempt on the president's wife. The carriage had been unscrewed. Someone had tampered with it when she was coming down from the soldiers' home, which was the Camp David of its day. And he would go up there actually and work, for example, on the draft of the Emancipation Proclamation. Anyway, she was coming back to the White House and was thrown from the carriage, hit her head on a rock. Lincoln was so consumed with, remember, not only Gettysburg but Vicksburg, that he had a finite amount of time to nurse his wife. But, you know, who knows what physical impact, what lasting impact that may have had. So I think a number of psychological and physical factors, plus the fact this woman saw, 3 of her 4 children die. She saw her husband assassinated at her side. And in the end, her 4th and surviving son had her committed to a mental institution.
How did she handle the assassination? I mean, he was the first president assassinated. There was nobody had gone through that before.
Yeah, and remember, of course, the the conventions of Victorian mourning precluded the widow from even attending the funeral. There are stories that that weekend, remember Lincoln, of course, was shot on Good Friday, died Saturday morning, and they took the body back to the White House, of course, and they had an autopsy, and then this remarkable 20-day-long pageant of grief began, reversing the route that he had followed from to the inauguration. But anyway, there was a service in the East Room. She didn't attend, but the story is all that weekend, people throughout the house could hear her wailing from upstairs. I mean, it was that. Anyway, it's hard to imagine what that house must have been like. She did not leave for a month. And then when she did, I think it had already begun to sink in the contrast between what she had known as First Lady and the horror that she was about to experience. Remember, she had a very practical reason for wanting her husband reelected in 1864. She was scared to death that if he didn't win, he would find out she was $27,000 in debt, most for clothes. Well, Lincoln actually, Lincoln is the classic American success story. He died leaving an estate of about $110,000, which would be obviously considerably more today. So she by rights should not have been in any really financial worries. But this was a subject that she developed an obsession on. At the same time, her obsession about shopping, which is one thing most people know about Mrs. Lincoln, preyed on her. She was at one point reduced to selling her dresses, which of course was a public humiliation and which only generated more criticism. She'd said that if that Butcher Grant ever became president, she was leaving the country. He did, and she did. She wandered around Europe, a ghost, accompanied for a few years by Tad, who was really all she had left. And then he died in 1871, I believe of typhoid. And of course, you can imagine the impact that that had on her. It was a horrible coda to a life that had been tumultuous under the best of circumstances. And of course, it culminated in the permanent estrangement from her surviving son. The interesting thing is, of course, she was hospitalized for about 4 months. And then one of the first women lawyers in America, a woman named Myra Bridewell, went to bat for her and successfully argued before a court in Illinois that she should be released. In the meantime, she had twice attempted suicide. She went to Europe for 4 years, mostly in France, where she'd put to good use what she'd learned all those years earlier at Mademoiselle Montel. And then in 1880, she came back. By that time, guess what? Congress got around to voting her a pension of $3,000 a year. Sarah Polk got the same. And she only lived 2 more years. She went back to Springfield, back to the house in which she married a young, gangling, politically ambitious lawyer in 1842, and 40 years after that fact, she died in an upstairs bedroom and was buried at Oak Ridge. Oh, by the way, the first decision she made, the city fathers in Springfield, as Lincoln was barely cold, when they figured he was coming home, and they bought a prime plot downtown. If you know Springfield, it's the site of the Capitol, quote, the new Capitol. But it was intended to be Lincoln's final resting place until Mrs. Lincoln found out about it. And she said, no way. She wanted Oak Ridge Cemetery, which they had visited. And Lincoln had commented on what a peaceful place it was. And she told them that if basically they didn't give in to her wishes, then she would have him buried somewhere else. And I guess possession is 9/10 of the law, especially if you're the widow. So, and she had never minded pissing off people in Springfield before. So, I think, you know, when you say what kind of first lady was she, it's so difficult to answer that question. There are a lot of things that you can point to that invite criticism. Because of her death, for example, there's no shortage of evidence that at some point she was reduced to, well, it's thought she was selling state secrets to the press. She may very well have been selling jobs. She looked for everywhere in the federal budget where she could cadge money and claim that it was a White House operating expense. So on the one hand, you can go to the extreme and say, probably today she would have been indicted. On the other hand, what she was living through day after day after day was far worse emotionally, it seems to me, than any court of law would have been. And I think one reason we don't know her better, and perhaps don't have a higher opinion of her, is I think entirely to her credit. She volunteered in hospitals. She visited soldiers in numerous hospitals, and she insisted on not being accompanied by reporters. She said those visits were Mrs. Abraham Lincoln's, not Mrs. President Lincoln's. All she had to do was to invite a friendly reporter or two along, and there would have been gushing stories that historians could have quoted, and all of us would be familiar with, and who knows, how it might have affected our view. But she was star-crossed from childhood until those last years in Springfield.
Let's move.
A tragic figure.
Okay, let's move on and talk a little bit about Mrs. Grant.
Now, Mrs. Grant, on the other hand, loved every day she was in the White House. She came from a slaveholding family in Missouri. She, not to put too fine a point on it, if you've seen pictures of Mrs. Grant, she's not a ravishing beauty. On the other hand, he wasn't the most handsome catch either, especially when he was drunk. And by the way, he was drunk mostly when he was apart from Julia, which I guess is one way of measuring love. When he was in the Army, it seems to have been love at first sight, which is interesting. She was slightly cross-eyed. And the story goes, I don't know if that affected love at first sight, but the story goes that at one point, medicine had advanced to the point where they could correct this mild condition. And Grant said, no, Julia, I love your eyes the way they are. And I don't know if it's true or not, but it doesn't matter in some ways, because that's the kind of relationship they had. They were a partnership. Now, there's another side to this. Mrs. Grant redecorated the White House in a style critics referred to as Steamboat Gothic. Which, by the way, brings home a recurring theme from the beginning of the Republic. Whoever is First Lady, if you dare to renovate the White House, be prepared for criticism, blasts of criticism, much of it unfair or even irrational. On the other hand, in this case, it was reinforced by the fact that, remember, now we're at the height of the Victorian era, and Julia Grant was famous for her elaborate dinners, and I mean elaborate. One of them clocked in at 29 courses. Now, if you look at the pictures of President Grant at the beginning of his presidency and at the end of his presidency, you make the connection. He ate well, at least. She loved the White House. On the other hand, it's interesting, she thought of it also as, and this recurring tension, it's a family home. At the same time, it is a public office building. It is a museum. It is a campaign headquarters. It is a war room. It is a museum. It is a theater. It is all of these things, rolled into one. Her solution was she was sick of having the people of Washington in her backyard, because in those days the White House gates were wide open, and it was treated as a public park. And she wanted room for her children to play. People forget, U.S. Grant was only 46 years old when he became president, and he had young children, and as young as, say, the Roosevelt family, and they had no place to play. So she ordered the gates locked, which probably didn't make her popular locally. On the other hand, it's interesting, she also gave orders that any African American who wanted to come to one of her receptions was to be admitted. Very striking, seemingly small, but defining gesture. And Grant, who has been blamed for a lot of other things, has been rediscovered in recent years and dusted off as the last president for 80 years who was willing to use federal troops to enforce civil rights laws. The next president was another general, Dwight Eisenhower, in Little Rock. So Julia was heartbroken when, of course, at the end of 2 terms, they left. She said Ulysses, that's what she called him. She felt like a waif. They had nowhere to go. And he said he was a waif too. We're both waifs. So they went around the world for 2.5 years, came back, were acclaimed. Americans have short memories. They'd forgotten the scandals. They remembered General Grant, the hero. And he was almost nominated for an unprecedented third term. And then there were waifs again. Went to New York City, and that's where Grant was swindled and spent the last days of his life fighting his greatest battle and demonstrating. There's always been a mystery about Grant. This seemingly ordinary little man who failed at everything except generaling and writing his memoirs, and yet demonstrated genuine greatness and heroism in both of those functions. Julia, of course, was with him at the end at Mount McGregor. 2 million people turned out for his funeral in New York. And remember, the reason he wrote his memoirs, because he'd been approached and turned down publishers before, was he was broke. At one point, he and Julia pooled their resources. They had less than $100. So Grant accepted Mark Twain's proposal, and he wrote what is to this day regarded as one of the great memoirs in American history, and certainly the finest to come out of the Civil War. It only deepens the mystery of Grant in some ways, and it left Julia provided for, because the book was such an enormous success that she and her family received $400,000 in royalties. And then she wrote a memoir that had considerably less public success. In fact, it wasn't published until 1976. She died in 1902 and was laid to rest in that understated mausoleum up on Morningside Heights in New York.
You had a number of first ladies who weren't really active and deeply involved, but then Lucy Webb Hayes came along and kind of revived the first lady role. What did she do that was so important?
Well, you know, it's interesting. First of all, she's much more than Lemonade Lucy. She's more than the first lady who started the Easter egg roll. All that's, you know, part of her historical resume. She was, at the time, saluted as the new woman. Now, what did that mean? It did not mean a woman in the Eleanor Roosevelt mold, an activist campaigning for causes. On the other hand, she is the first lady to graduate from college. And so there was a sense that she was breaking down educational barriers to opportunity. Remember, Hayes had been elected in a disputed contest. To this day, historians are arguing over whether he won or not. The Democrats refer to him as his fraudulency. Ironically, he left office hugely respected because he had turned out to be, in fact, a much better president, even a unifying president, than many people had expected. But there, you know, politicians can be petty, and they took it out on poor Mrs. Hayes. They withheld money for White House renovations, and so she was reduced to moving furniture around to cover holes in the rugs, that sort of thing. She also bequeathed. Her husband was independently wealthy, and so they dipped into his fortune, and they bequeathed their gift. Most presidents and first ladies leave something behind, tangible, as a legacy. And the Hayes left one of the most unusual. You may have seen pictures of it. You may have seen it. You've been to the White House. But a complete China service spawned by the bicentennial and celebrating American flora and fauna, which meant the oyster plates are shaped like oysters. Mrs. Henry Adams, Clover Adams, who was as acerbic as her husband, said it was very disconcerting to go to the White House for dinner and all evening long, while you're trying to eat your dinner, staring at a coyote who's about to pounce upon you. In any event, it is a visually a remarkable legacy. She was a great temperance advocate. Indeed, the president was as well. She had the first telephone. She was also a modernizer. She had the first telephone in the White House. And believe it or not, it was number one. That was, I always wondered, who called? You know? I mean, did it ever ring? You know? Anyway, that's one of those little historical mysteries that we don't know.
Yeah. Francis Cleveland married President Cleveland during his first term. How was that received?
Oh, well, actually, Americans have always had a celebrity thing. I mean, the First Lady was becoming a celebrity. Lucy Hayes is generally regarded as the first woman to be widely referred to as First Lady. A lot of people think Jackie Kennedy is the youngest First Lady in American history, and no, in fact, Frances Folsom was 21 when the man she referred to as Uncle Cleve, we don't know what she called him after they were married, but he had known her since she was an infant. She was the daughter of his law partner in Buffalo, and he was, not legally, but he was unofficially, in effect, her guardian. And he'd been a lifelong bachelor, and of course there was stories attached to him in that state, which did not prevent him from winning election against an even more corrupt Republican opponent. The difference being Cleveland was corrupt in his private life, and James G. Blaine was corrupt in his public life. So anyway, the voters, given the choice, decided to take Cleveland. Cleveland's sister, Rose, was a great intellectual, and she found the White House unutterably dull. She said she spent her time in receiving lines silently conjugating Greek verbs. Now, I don't know, I suspect there may have been subsequent First Ladies who felt otherwise, or felt the same way, but in any event, talk about the social event of the season. To this day, Grover Cleveland is the only president to be married in the White House. Woodrow Wilson was married, of course, as president. John Tyler was married, but neither of them in the White House. Also, talk about modernity. The press followed them on their honeymoon with telescopes. Yeah, and Cleveland was livid. Presidents in the 19th century didn't have to pretend to welcome or even tolerate that degree of press attention. She became almost an unwanted celebrity. Her image was used for commercial purposes. Now, the fact is, you would have thought the telephone company would have hired the Hayeses, but there are actually posters of Rutherford and Lucy Hayes, obviously weren't consulted on this, endorsing an iron, a kitchen iron. But by the time that Frances Cleveland came along, she was a much more glamorous figure. She very stately. She was 21, but everyone who met her commented on how mature she seemed. Beautifully dressed. She was born to the role, just a natural, and she took to it like a natural. And eventually, the Clevelands had several children. One of the most famous in White House history was Ruth, who, of course, gave her name to the candy bar. So the next time you have a baby Ruth, close your eyes and think of Grover Cleveland. Anyway.
What about Caroline Harrison? She's considered one of the more progressive
Yeah,
first
and
ladies.
again, not well known to us today. Mrs. Harrison was the daughter of a Presbyterian minister who believed in education and indeed votes for women. She did not take up the suffrage cause, but in many other ways, first of all, she was a great steward of the White House. By the time she got to the White House, remember, the Hayeses had been denied funding. The place was literally falling down. It was so bad, I mean, the vermin were, she did get an appropriation to get rid of the vermin. She actually fell ill from escaping sewer gas in the White House. Things were that bad. So she commissioned architects, and they came up with this extraordinary plan to preserve and greatly expand the White House into what really looks like a European palace. Harrison was not good at making friends on Capitol Hill, and Congress refused by a very narrow margin to endorse this plan. But in many ways, it lives on in the form of the East and West Wings that we know today. So, Caroline Harrison was the first president of the Daughters of the American Revolution. Mrs. Harrison also had a real sense of White House history. She began the White House China collection. And indeed, she was a very gifted artist. She designed the Harrison's china, which many people think is the most attractive of all the White House china. And the other thing she did, I don't know how she spent her time, people would write into her, mothers who just had children that they named Benjamin Harrison, and she would paint something and send it to them, candlesticks or milk dispensers or baby bottles. Imagine the First Lady, of the United States spending her time. But anyway, it's a window into a woman who we really don't know nearly as well as we should.
How would you describe the transformation of the role during this era, during this period that we've been discussing tonight?
I think it was understated. I think by the end of the century, on the one hand, you had Ida McKinley, who was the ultimate sort of Dole-like invalid, who needed care, who was adored by her husband, who insisted on accompanying him to the White House, to all kinds of social events, on his trips, notwithstanding her very frail health. She had had a tragic life. I don't mean for a moment to dismiss her suffering. She'd lost her mother, and then in a very short period of time, she lost both of their young daughters. And she, in giving birth to the second child, something happened. To this day, no one knows for sure. The common diagnosis was epilepsy. And it would recur for the rest of her life. Until, oddly enough, President McKinley, capping the tragedies in her life, was assassinated in Buffalo in September 1901. And there were people around the deathbed who said we'd best prepare for a double funeral. They took it for granted that the shock of this, McKinley's first words after being shot were, "Be careful how you tell my wife." They had a remarkable lifelong. He would tell the vice president's wife, if you'd only seen Ida when she was young. Ida was so beautiful. And in his mind, the woman he loved, wraith-like, white as a sheet, barely able to speak sometimes, was that ravishing young bank teller in Canton, Ohio, with whom he had fallen head over heels in love. Anyway, McKinley died on the 14th of September. The funeral was held in Washington and Canton. Mrs. McKinley went back to Canton, and to the astonishment of all, not only survived, but never had another epileptic fit.
We are going to open up to your questions and answers in just a moment. So if you have a question, you can We'll have students coming out. You can raise your hands. They'll bring a mic by to you. But Richard, a number of folks have asked me tonight, are you still doing the bus tours you used to do?
Oh, I am. Listen, I'll tell you a quick plug. May, 9 days in the South. We're going to Birmingham, Montgomery, Warm Springs, Atlanta, Plains, Andersonville, Jekyll Island and the Millionaires Club. Live like a Vanderbilt for 24 hours. Then up to Savannah and Charleston. And we're going to put 30 people on a bus, and I'll be leading it, and the weather should be gorgeous and should be fun. If you want to find out more, you can go online, Presidents and Patriots, all one word, .com, or if you you can talk to a real live human being by calling 202-657-7444. Thanks.
You bet. Okay, let's go with questions. Raise your hand if you have a question.
Hi. Thank you so much for being here. My question is, who is the most noble of first ladies in U.S. history?
That's an impossible question for me to answer. I'm not being dismissive. The gentleman want to know who was, I thought, the most noble first lady in American history. I'm not sure I would apply that rather loaded term. I mean, there are lots of ways of measuring first ladies. I know, for example, you may have heard today the survey that was released, actually just today, that C-SPAN, as a matter of fact, took with over 250, I think, historians around the country on a variation of this question. And they had, I think, 10 or 12 different criteria that they applied. And, more power to them. The older I get, the more, frankly, skeptical I am, I guess is the way I would put it, that in the 21st century, with our definitions, our expectations of what we expect from a first lady, that we can put ourselves in the mindset of someone in the early 19th century who had totally different definitions of womanly success. We like to think that we've come a long way and that the intervening 200 years represents progress. And I think by and large that's true. And indeed, there are many who believe that we still have some ways to go. But I think it's hard enough to rank presidents. But the Constitution at least spells out. And indeed, there are things that are obvious, a party leader, the ability to communicate and rally support for a program. Those are official functions that I all agree on. I don't know how one of the things that I at least come away from this series is an appreciation that every single one of these women, in her own way, even poor Jane Pierce, tried to contribute something, and every one of them in their own way made a sacrifice for the good of their country. And I leave definitions of nobility to others.
Okay, we have a question right here.
I was taken by the comment of Lucy Hayes moving the furniture to cover up the holes in the carpet. I assume that and from all your comments, that they did a lot more open entertaining than our presidents do today. Would you comment on that?
What do you mean by open entertaining?
Well, of having the White House as an open to the public more, or maybe more social functions than they do today.
Well, as a matter of fact, for example, Frances Cleveland had talk about good political instincts as well as just plain graciousness. She made sure to have her regular receptions scheduled at times when the working women of Washington could attend. So weekends, for example. The White House was certainly much more open. Remember, up until 1929, every year on the 1st of January was a public reception. And everyone lined up and they went into the White House and shook the president's hand. And indeed, up through the Coolidge presidency, for an hour every day at noon, business stopped and the president shook hands. Coolidge set a record. He could shake over 2,000 hands in an hour. Of course, the secret was he didn't say anything. You could probably shake 2,000 hands in an hour if you didn't say anything.
Okay, we have a question in the back.
I wonder if you could make some comments about Lucretia Garfield.
I could, and I'd be honest with you, I'm tempted to save it for the C-SPAN broadcast at 9 o'clock. Put it this way: the Garfields had a very bumpy love match, which I don't know what's more tragic, that it evolved into a genuine love match, or that having done so, it was then, of course, tragically cut short by the president's assassination. Garfield is someone we should know more about. He's a really interesting historical figure in his own right, as someone emblematic of the times. So is Lucretia. Lucretia Garfield, they're wonderful letters. What are we going to do 50 years from now when there are no letters, for people to read? Lucretia Garfield would pour out her doubts. She doubted that James Garfield loved her. She doubted that she personally wanted to get married. She doubted she wanted to get married to James Garfield. Subsequently, many of her doubts were frankly confirmed. He was very attractive to women, and he seems to have returned the attentions on at least one occasion. There was some real doubt about whether the Garfield marriage would survive. And then, again, tragically, what brought them together was the death of 2 children. And they had 2 more children, and became quite devoted. When Garfield died, by the way, the American people spontaneously showered the widow and her young family with $360,000 in contributions. And she used much of it to build a memorial library, in effect the first presidential library, to house his papers at the Garfield home in Mentor, Ohio, which again, if you're ever in the Cleveland area, take a couple hours to go to Mentor and visit the Garfield home. It's spectacular.
Okay, we have a question right here.
What are your thoughts on Lillian Rogers Park's book, Backstairs at the White House, or My 30 Years Backstairs at the White House, and its portrayal of the first families and their private lives during those 3 decades?
Well, I'm torn, because like any historian, of course, it's like historians' attitudes about tapes. If you believe in the Constitution and human decency, you're offended to hell. But that a president would do anything so offensive as taping you without your permission. If you're a historian, you fall down on your knees in gratitude that you have this incredible inside record, of who really said what to whom. Likewise, I mean, imagine if you're a member of a presidential family, any of those families in that book. And I'm not saying the book was written with malice, and in fact, it's turned out to be a useful source in many ways. I'm torn between the human dimension. I know this from talking to residents of the White House, of both parties, it's universal. One reason why they place such trust in the permanent staff, indeed treating them like members of the family, is because like members of the family, they respect their privacy, and they are aware of the privilege that they have been given to be participants in, as well as observers of unfolding history. They don't go out and write books about it.
Okay, question? Moan now. I know somebody's got a question.
No one asked me who the worst First Lady is.
Would you like to answer that?
No, just as I said, I shy away from the ability. I noticed the survey put poor Jane Pierce. And, I don't know what you know about the Pierce story very quickly. Mrs. Pierce, who hated politics, who fainted when her husband was nominated for president, who saw her sole surviving son killed in a train wreck following his election, who concluded as a good Calvinist that this was divine punishment for his ambition, who experienced 4 years of hell in the White House. One of her activities was writing letters to her dead son. And you can see them. Many of them survive to this day at the Library of Congress. I mean, you can make heart-rending documents. So I'm not sure if we shouldn't just give poor Mrs. Pierce a pass and take it out on her husband. He was the worst president. But leave Mrs. Pierce out of this.
We covered a lot of ground tonight, Richard. Is there any First Lady that we haven't talked about that you can think of that you'd like to say a few or offer a few thoughts about?
No, I mean, I think for this period, we've gone in depth. We're about to turn a corner, turn a page, turn a century. And with Theodore Roosevelt and his remarkable family, I don't know what the first modern First Lady is, but we can all agree the first modern president is Theodore Roosevelt. And Edith Roosevelt will have the greatest impact on the physical White House of any American First Lady, including Mrs. Kennedy.
Okay. Richard, thanks for a great
You bet.
program tonight.
Thank
It was
you.
terrific. Thank you all for coming out tonight. We appreciate your support and hope to see everybody back here next Wednesday night. Thank you all for coming.